Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Center for American Progress. I'm Vikram Singh, the Vice President here at the center, and I'm really glad you all could join us for this public session we're holding in the midst of a really important program that the Center for American Progress and the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation are conducting on the future of the U.S. Japan alliance. Our group has been meeting for over the course of the past year in Tokyo and here in Washington, and we will be producing a joint vision basically for where we should go with this critical alliance in the coming months, hopefully by early November. And these sessions have been really fantastic. So I want to thank Yoichi Funabashi, the leader of the RJIF, for being such a terrific partner. I want to thank the Japan Foundation Center for helping make a lot of these meetings and sessions possible. And I want to thank our terrific partners at the Embassy of Japan here in Washington, who are really supportive of CAP's work on U.S. Japan relations and U.S. work in our work in Asia. I'm tremendously honored to be joined on the stage by Dr. Kurt Campbell, known to many of you, known to anybody who cares about Asia policy. Kurt is, of course, founder and chairman of the Asia Group. He's also, as everyone knows, founder and leader of the Center for New American Security. He's a bright light in all matters of foreign policy and national security for the United States, especially policy on Asia, and especially a great friend of Japan and somebody who has been involved with every aspect of this alliance over really the last 2 decades. And so we couldn't be more fortunate than to have Kurt. And rather than just do a broadcast, we thought we'd have a conversation with you all for the next 25 minutes, and then we'd turn it over to our distinguished panel. So again, thank you all for joining us, and welcome Kurt.
Thank you, Vikram. It's great to be here.
So Kurt, I want to start out with just a framing question. And especially in this political season, there has been a lot of question about American alliances, about what our role in the world is, about how we should think about these partnerships. Are they a burden? Are they an asset? Why is the U.S.-Japan relationship important? Why should the Japanese people and the American people believe that this alliance, with all it brings with it, the obligations, the costs, the other things, why does it matter so much for our two countries?
Thank you, Vikram. And let me just begin by thanking the center. I want to commend you, the work that the Japan and Asia team has done at CAP. My friend Glenn Fukushima is here. I do want to pay particular tribute to Funabashi-san. And one of the things that we were reflecting on as we were preparing to take the stage is what's happened in the last 15 or 20 years. I can remember when I was working on the U.S. Japan alliance in the 1990s, there was a remarkably thin layer of people that were knowledgeable and understood the importance of the alliance. Most of them were Republican, all served with great distinction. What's happened over the last 15 or 20 years is that we see a new generation of people on both the American and Japanese side across the political spectrum that appreciate and understand the importance of this alliance going forward. The role that Funabashi-san has played with his think tank and encouraging support and engagement on these issues cannot be underestimated. Let me just, in answer to your question, those of you who've worked on and understand the alliance know that there is a certain nomenclature and language that is always used historically about the alliance in terms of how it's referenced. No relationship is more important, bar none. It's as important as any bilateral relationship in the world. My sense is that even though the alliance is going to change fundamentally, we are entering a period in which the U.S.-Japan alliance is much more important than it ever has been. And I think there is a deeper recognition in both Tokyo and Washington that the responsibilities that are placed on the leaders and those who are entrusted with strengthening and developing the alliance has never been greater, and that's going to continue over time. I think as the alliance changes, we have to confront some very challenging things, Vikram. One is, let's be clear, for years, the U.S. Japan alliance on the security side was the United States making most of the decisions, Japan quite content with that. That's completely changed now. Japan is a full partner in discussions, in decision making, in planning around security issues. The United States has to yield in some of those areas. We have to adapt in our culture in terms of how we engage a partner like Japan. And I think we have to recognize that a new generation of Japanese leaders and policymakers are interested in two things. One is a much stronger, more honest, more extensive bilateral partnership with the United States. And frankly with other nations as well. What we've seen under Prime Minister Abe is an attempt to rebuild bonds with South Korea, but new relationships with India, with Australia, also ensuring that bilateral relations with China remain on a relatively steady track. At the same time that Vikram, that Japanese friends are seeking to strengthen the alliance, they're also seeking a greater independence in the formulation and execution of their own foreign policy. And I think that is one of the most healthy developments in a relationship. Any sense that Japan was simply a country that always followed the United States and took only initiatives that were approved in Washington. That's not in our best interests, and it's not in Japan's best interests. And so what we've seen from Prime Minister Abe in particular is a Japan that both wants to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance and establish an essential Japanese identity at the United Nations, in Southeast Asia, across a number of diplomatic fronts. And I think the United States has to encourage that going forward.
Let me just touch on a specific instance of that. Major subject of our discussions yesterday actually was Russia, an area where the U.S. and Japan clearly agree in terms of decrying Russian aggression, in terms of support for sanctions that were implemented against Russia for the occupation of Crimea. At the same time, Prime Minister Abe has on the books a meeting with President Putin, and they're expected to talk about some longstanding territorial issues between those two countries. That could strike some as Japan, making nice with Russia, even while we're in the United States having such difficult time with Russia. How does that fit into this formula?
Vikram, it's a great question. I was at the bilateral meeting 2 weeks ago in New York between Prime Minister Abe and Secretary Clinton, and Prime Minister Abe made very clear on a number of fronts. Number one, that Japan would continue to follow closely the Security Council resolutions with respect to sending a clear allied message of deep unhappiness with Russian actions in the Ukraine, and to cease and desist certain provocations associated with that and elsewhere. At the same time, he made clear that Japan also had to look for signs and opportunities for engagement with Russia, much in the way the United States is trying to do in places like Syria as well. And he explained why Japan and Russia had in fact never concluded the Second World War, and they had huge outstanding issues, and that currently Russia's sole line of strategic entry into Asia really fundamentally is through China, and that there is an interest in a better relationship between Russia and Japan. And Secretary Clinton said, yes, I accept that. I accept that strategic wisdom. So I think that approach in which Japanese friends are clear in advance and are still adhering to the essential features of international diplomacy, but also exploring opportunities for improving relations, I think this is exactly what should be supported and encouraged.
Let me stick in the security realm for just a minute, and it's sort of a two-pronged question. So the most sort of proximate threat or concern is clearly the provocations out of the DPRK. The missile test, the progress on the nuclear program is getting to the point where people are having serious conversations about, what if the DPRK tests in the air? What if they, lash out in some way, in a way that threatens or actually harms Japan, South Korea? So where's the DPRK fit in terms of the alliance and priorities and what we need to be planning? And also a little bit about the Japan-South Korea relationship and that trilateral cooperation among these allies. It's another area in which there have been times when Japan has gone its own way in ways that the United States has thought might not be constructive with South Korea. And you've had a lot of bumps in the roads in that leg of this triangle.
Thanks, Vikram. Let me take on the first part of the question on DPRK and then a little bit on the important issue you raised on the bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea and what American hopes are going forward. So let me just say that in her speeches and in the speech that Jake Sullivan, her policy coordinator, gave in New York at the Asia Society, I think what we've seen is a very clear laydown that if Secretary Clinton is elected president, the United States is going to take some very tough measures with respect to North Korea. Look, I think we have to acknowledge that it is often stated that North Korea is one of the most heavily sanctioned countries in the world. In fact, there are many other situations where countries have faced much stiffer sanctions: Iran, Cuba, even Myanmar. And I think we have to recognize that by some estimates, if you look at the great reporting by Anna Fitfield and the Washington Post over the course of the last year or so, North Korea is growing rather substantially. And much of that comes from certain kinds of interactions with China. I think we need to have a very clear conversation in Northeast Asia that anyone who is supporting business with North Korea financially is at risk, that there are possible sanction regimes that we have tested and have been demonstrated to be effective in Iran that could be applied in this context. At the same time, your point about the threat, remember during the G20, North Korea launched missiles that landed in the waters of economic exclusive zone of Japan in the 200-mile area. So this is not a hypothetical situation. This is the real deal. So North Korea is in fact job one for alliance practitioners in the period ahead, and it requires much greater coordination to strengthen our deterrence, to ensure that we're planning for every kind of scenario, not just the bolt out of the blue, but also asymmetrical challenges that we've faced in the past before. I believe that the U.S. Japan relationship is up to this task, and we've really, I think, modernized, Vikram, under your leadership and others at the Pentagon, a number of efforts behind the scenes. The most important thing that's been accomplished in the last year or so is the rebuilding of trust and confidence, though, between Tokyo and Seoul. And, it's challenging politically for both sides, but what has been accomplished to support a rapprochement, support for the so-called comfort women, a degree of dignity and financial support there provided by Japan, I think is an important step in rebuilding the bilateral trust between these two essential countries. From my perspective, probably the most important thing that the United States can do in Asia is to encourage strongly better relations between Japan and South Korea. What we essentially have is two incredibly strong bilateral relationships, as strong partnerships as we have in the world with South Korea and Japan. The challenge over the next 10 years is for the United States to stretch that and to increasingly find opportunities to trilateralize these two critical bilateral relationships and to see what's possible to create a common set of expectations around politics, around security, and the like. I am under no illusions that that is an easy task, but the United States has devoted itself at really hard tasks before, and this is something that I think with a purposeful effort can be achieved and accomplished. Part of that has to do with contingency planning. Part of it has to do with dealing with incredibly difficult, challenging issues like how to work most productively with the rise of China. Vikram, these are all things that I think are on the table for the next administration, and I think we've got our work cut out for us.
Let's talk about the rise of China for a minute in the context of this alliance and our other alliances. Chinese counterparts will regularly say the U.S. alliance system is outdated, outmoded, and would have gone by the wayside and evolved into something different if not for an effort to contain or somehow constrain or somehow oppose China. What is the right way for the United States, Japan, to approach that, what is, I think, a very real expressed Chinese concern that demands some sort of reassurance, but that is also hints at genuine concerns by the alliance partners about what China's ultimate intentions are in the region, so has an element of truth to it. How does the alliance system that we have modernize in the 21st century and produce a constructive environment with China?
So, I know, Vikram, and I like the question. I think it's an interesting one. I personally am much more about clarity of American purpose than I am about sort of an effort to reassure. If we have to reassure about anything in Asia, it is of our continuing engagement in the region. I don't think we have anything to apologize for, and I do not believe that the United States' role has been anything other than contributing to the 40 or 50 best years in Asia's history, right? And so I think we, along with other countries, have helped create what you might describe as an operating system that has allowed for remarkable peace and prosperity, to lift people out of poverty, to build a thriving middle class, to lead to remarkable innovation around Asia. So I think the key here is that the United States has to tackle several things simultaneously. The first is I'm of the view that the bilateral alliance system is still remarkably relevant to the challenges of Asia, and they continue to be revitalized over time. And this has been like a relay race between administrations, between Republicans and Democrats, and that process is going to continue. Secondly, I do believe a very clear determination on the part of the United States that it is in our best strategic interest to engage constructively China, is in the best interest of our bilateral relationship, but the region as a whole, and to underscore that that relationship will invariably have areas where we work together, and there are going to be areas where we're going to compete, and there are going to be areas where we occasionally vociferously disagree. And to recognize that that is the essential trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship. So people who decry the tension in the relationship or the friction don't understand the current phase of U.S.-China relations. And that if there isn't some tension in the relationship, it probably means that someone is not doing their job. But it also suggests that it does not end there. The United States has to make a much deeper commitment to multilateralism. Asia's in the period of building fundamental institutions, the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum. These used to be thought of as an afterthought, of not particularly significant. We have now come to recognize that these institutions are incredibly important and that we have to join it and contribute to it full bore. And so what I would say is the key, Vikram, is not one thing. It is a multifaceted strategy. But at the top, relies upon strong alliances between the United States and Japan.
I particularly like saying, we don't have anything to apologize for, and I think that's important. An important point that this partnership has been a source of stability and strength and peace since the end of World War II, and it's going to be a great, productive relationship going forward. In that sense, there are a lot of things that the U.S. and Japan both agree on and can actively cooperate on. So aside from that military defense aspect, what's the partnership going to be doing in the 21st century with other regions on global issues like climate change, in Southeast Asia with rising powers like India? Do you see some? Do you think there's a few things that we should focus on in particular as partners?
So you already listed the kind of the to-do list that I would do. I think the United States and Japan are clear partners on in the time after the Paris Accords on implementation, on innovation. Japan has much that it can teach the United States in terms of a more efficient, less carbon using set of industries and capabilities. There is enormous possibility, I think, for closer coordination in Southeast Asia. Japan and India have developed a much closer partnership. I think Japan can actually help facilitate the United States more deeply engaging friends in India. Those are all critical things. I'd put at the top of the list, though, Vikram's something else, which I think there is a critical bilateral component that has to be regenerated over time, and that's part of what Funabashi has done. We need more people-to-people exchange. We need, polling in both societies has never been more positive, but we need more educational exchange. We need more Americans who study Japanese, more Japanese who study English. We need more cultural engagement, more opportunities for tourism, a greater connectivity between our two societies. And that has to have a multifaceted set of components, from education to commerce to military and security to politics. And we have to recognize, although at the core of the alliance are hardcore security issues, this alliance cannot simply survive on that alone. It must be multifaceted. It must be embraced across a wider society.
I have time for one more question, and it's a big one, so you have to just wave top it. But one of the things both of us are struggling with is sustaining and growing our middle class. Basically, for Japan, it's getting out of a very long period of stagnation. For the United States, it's getting back to a higher pace of growth and being able to have equitable growth, being able to have basically more broad-based prosperity in our two societies. That is something that we talk to our Japanese counterparts about a lot in terms of innovations and policies and ways that you can basically help make a market economy work better for more of your citizens. How do you see that partnership applying to the welfare of our own people in our own societies?
It's a great question. So look, I'm not going to rehearse. You've heard very clearly the statements of our candidates around TPP, but rather than talking about it in the United States context, I'd like to talk about it in the Japanese context. If you look at the countries that have been involved in that process, no country has taken on special interests. No country has tackled some of the structural issues harder and more forcefully than Japan has. And I think Prime Minister Abe and his team deserve enormous credit for taking these steps that are really about structural reform and about a closer potential commercial and economic relationship between the United States and Japan. And let's remember, we've gone decades without real progress on a variety of commercial areas. And what the Japanese team and side has attempted to do is say, right, we are making our bed with a closer relationship with the United States, and we should not lose track of that and recognize that that is part of what we hope to see as a successful third arrow. I think we all know that the next year or two will be absolutely crucial for structural reforms in the third era in Japan. And I think we have to also acknowledge not enough has been done. And that again, just as the alliance cannot simply be about military cooperation, it cannot thrive unless there is a sense of growth and optimism in both countries.
Kurt, it's always such a pleasure. Really thank you for coming to join us here to help us get a lot of energy into our second day of this dialogue. And please, everybody, join me in thanking Kurt, and then I'll hand over to Senior Fellow Glenn Fukushima for the panel.
So as we're readying the stage for the panel discussion, let me quickly introduce the four panelists that we have. I think all of these people are well known to you, but just let me quickly introduce first, we will have come up to the stage Mr. Yoichi Funabashi, who is the co-founder and chairman of the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation. He has had a long and distinguished career as a journalist with the Asahi Shimbun. I first met Yoichi in 1975 at Harvard University when he was an Eman Fellow, and I was about 15 years old. So please, Yoichi, have a seat. Secondly, let me introduce Associate Professor Ken Jimbo of Keio University. He's an associate professor of political science and one of the leading experts in Japan on international relations, national security policy. He's also a fellow at the Kandan Institute for Global Studies and also at the Tokyo Foundation. Our third panelist is Professor Tomoko Ako, who is a professor the associate professor at Tokyo University. She was previously at Waseda University and is one of the leading younger scholars in Japan with regard to China, where she's done extensive research. And then our final panelist from the Center for American Progress is Brian Harding, who is the director for East and Southeast Asia for the National Security and International Policy section of the Center for American Progress. He's had a lot of experience both in Japan and also in Southeast Asia, and from 2009 to 2013 worked at the Department of Defense on East Asian issues. So, could I ask you to, Professor Ako, could I ask you to move? Yes. Thank you. Sorry about that. So, well, first I want to welcome all of you. Thank you very much for coming today, and want to thank, although Kurt and Vikram have left, I think they've provided a very full agenda for us to discuss today. They've touched on a wide range of subjects, starting from the importance of the U.S. Japan relationship, the need for the United States to understand Japan's desire to have more independence, and then specific topics that were discussed include Russia, North Korea, South Korea, China, regional institutions in Asia, partnership on a variety of global issues, including climate change, India, ASEAN, and the importance of people-to-people exchange, and TPP, structural reform in Japan. So that's a wide range of subjects. So let me begin first just with the first round. Very shortly, if you could give us your reactions to the discussion that took place between Kurt and Vikram. Just maybe about a 1-minute reaction, and then I'll get into specific issues. So Yoichi, would you like to start?
Thank you, Glenn. Actually, I was really impressed with Campbell's remarks, particularly concerning Russia. Actually, I'm very much encouraged to hear that the United States is very much prepared, ready to provide Japan some strategic space concerning Japan's relationship with Russia. I think this relationship, if Abe and Putin would be able to come up with some kind of New Deal, overcoming that more than 70 years of that tensions, and finally, closing the chapter of that World War II. I think that will be a really that contribute to stabilizing the whole region, not only in Northeast Asia, but I think that East Asia in more general terms. So I think that perhaps could be a game changer in that very positive terms, in my view, in the coming years.
Fine. Ken?
Well, I also enjoyed Kurt's initial remark we just heard, and obviously the Kurt is the architect of the Asia pivot and rebalancing strategy at the first Obama administration. And he's just written a book, and I carefully read those lines, and was quite interesting to see that Asia rebalancing, U.S. rebalancing to Asia is not only about U.S. engagement, but it is to encourage the internal dynamics of Asian allies and partners, and including China. And that also accelerate the thoughts how important Japan should play independently, not only in coordination with the United States, but also to promote its own agenda, to diversify its strategic portfolio in the region. And I think that why Kurt mentioned that Japan's Russia policy should be appreciated is because of, in this context, that Japan needs to pursue its own reaching out to other regions as well. So that's my main takeaway. And I think it is also important agendas are everywhere. Of course, coordination towards Southeast Asia policy. We have very disturbing, developments that we see in Philippines and also another major allies in Thailand. There are a lot to do to how to deal with these new development, because U.S. engagement part is all about, strategic portfolio of the United States should be expanded not only in Northeast Asia, but in the broader, in Southeast Asia and also beyond. So that I think it is very important for U.S.-Japan coordination, how to deal with such kind of diversified area of coordination, because it is not only that China is rising in Asia, but the rest of Asia are also rising. So that I think it is very much in need to incorporate those dynamics into the asset of the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Okay, Prince Rocco.
Thank you. I was also very much encouraged by Dr. Campbell's talk, particularly on China. She said that we should have a deeper engagement in China affairs. And I was thinking that, wow, China, particularly under the Xi Jinping administration, social tensions has risen. And of course, at the side of Japanese government and Japanese, business field, we should emphasize, economic relations, but we should not ignore the political aspect, because economy and politics are closely related. And I think U.S. was kind of a model for Japan to promote those, communication with China, particularly at the private sector. And I think that we should collaborate more to make China become sustainably developing. Otherwise, China is going to be a very risky factor for our allies between Japan and Japan and U.S. Yeah.
Thank you. Brian.
I thought Kurt's comments about Japan's as an independent actor were very important and spot on. And it reflected a confident U.S. foreign policy, generally a confidence in the U.S.-Japan alliance that I think is appropriate. And when I think about Japan's role in the world generally, Japan having a front row seat at figuring out how the 21st century ought to look is a good thing. That's a world I want to live in. And I think for the United States, the U.S. and for Japan, the U.S.-Japan alliance is a force multiplier for making sure that Japan has that front row seat. But if I could just pick up just very quickly on Professor Jimbo's comments, I think this is his comments about U.S.-Japan coordination in Southeast Asia are a perfect demonstration of where even, while Japan might be independent in designing its foreign policy towards particular third countries, there's also the value of coordination. And I think the case of the Philippines is one where we're going to have to be working incredibly closely over the coming years to make sure that we keep things on track.
Okay, fine. Great. So I think all the panelists agree that this notion of Japan having its own independence in foreign policy could have some good implications for the United States. And I'm curious to know from the panelists, in addition to Russia, where clearly I think it's something that is it's the most visible right now because of the tensions between the United States and Russia on the one hand, and the coming visit by President Putin to Japan in December, and these unresolved issues between Russia and Japan. But in addition to Russia, what are the other areas in which, maybe 2 or 3, 4 areas in which you think that Japan would like to pursue in a more independent manner than it has up to now? Any of the panelists want to start with some? Maybe Ken, you may have some ideas.
Well, if I mention one word on Russia, first of all, I think that I was very encouraged by Kurt about his understanding and introducing the event that when Prime Minister Abe and Hillary Clinton met at New York, and Clinton made a kind of decisive comment that she understands the strategic intent of what Japan is trying to do vis-a-vis Russia. And I think that Japan has been diversifying, as I mentioned, the strategic portfolio to reaching out to other regions. And Russia can be a very important factor, especially when we see that more like a diversified balance of power should be kept in a good shape in Asia, especially in dealing with China. So in that case, that Japan has every reason to reach out to Russia, especially to at least to complicate the Beijing's strategic calculation, how they can deal in Asia. And at the same time, I think engage Russia to be a constructive player in Asia is something that we still need to pursue. Of course, the United States have a difficult relation with Russia in every front, in Syria, Ukraine, and other places. But in Asia, there has been somewhat kind of meeting of the strategic interests between Russia and Japan. And also, Japan can encourage Russia to be engaged in Asia. And there has been Moscow's choices that they want to have its own version of people to Asia, but not always through China. So that Japan can be, spotlighted as an opportunity rather than the challenges. And I hope that there will be more like a generated understanding in Washington, D.C. about the strategic intent of Japan has been doing. And just to itemize what will be the additional things that we can do, I think for the region, I think our, reaching out to North Korea and what kind of like diplomatic choices or coordination that we have pursued in independent or in coordination with China and Russia and other partners should be something that we can really pursue. Southeast Asia, as Brian mentioned, especially to Philippines and Thailand, we do have the vast economic interests. At the same time that there have been new initiatives, so-called capacity building, that we can create the kind of low-level stability issues can be part as a very important factor to deal with that, what they try to do, especially in the South China Sea, and also their engagement in the continental Asian region. And so-called Indo-Pacific context of the maritime security is something that also to be shared. And Japan can deal with India and Australia to create the most stable sea lanes of communication through Malacca Strait and all the way to Middle East.
Yoichi?
Yeah, I also like to echo what Jimbo-san said about Russia. I think we also should think of the energy security. I think Japan and Russia can be very much complementary in ensuring the energy security for both. Particularly from Japanese perspective, we already have had Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2. So Russia has actually proven to be a very reliable supplier of gas. I think we perhaps we would have a very good chance, opportunity to expand this energy cooperation between Japan and Russia. And I think that will be a very plus sum. Also, I think we should also think of how to stabilize the Korean Peninsula, including a denuclearization of North Korea. We should certainly get Russia involved in this multilateral effort to put pressure on North Korea. Five-party talks process might be one of the viable options. So I think that Russia certainly should be treated and welcomed as a stakeholder on the peninsula. I think that perhaps the United States at one point should be advised to reset its Russian policy. And that the Korean Peninsula question is a part of that, I think, strategic calculus that we should take into account.
Ms. Rocco.
Yeah, I agree with Funabashi-san and Jimbo-sensei. And but from our national security's point of view, from our regional orders point of view, Russia is an important country, and we should work together. And but from other side, I think Japan also should learn more about what's happening in Russia. And of course, we have to make efforts in United States, as Hillary Clinton and Prime Minister Abe was discussing in their meeting. And we should pay more attention to global issues and human rights issues. Yeah, and we should show our understanding, yeah, more in these issues, yeah.
Thank you. Brian, I want to ask you a slightly different question that's related to this, but to the extent that there are new initiatives that Japan wants to undertake, obviously it's going to be very important for the two sides to have a good understanding of each other's motivations, intentions, and so forth. As someone who maybe is the only of the four panelists who've actually worked in government on U.S. Japan issues, in terms of the mechanisms or the structures in which the coordination is done between the U.S. and Japan, do you think that the current organizational structure is sufficient to take care of that, or what do you think might be ways to enhance or improve the ability of the U.S. and Japan to coordinate closely on these issues?
Right, and I think this is something that Vikram mentioned, that we're having a longer dialogue, and I think that's exactly what we'll discuss this afternoon. And I think just that the mechanisms need to evolve with how the U.S.-Japan alliance has evolved. I mean, for many years, it was really about bilateral issues, military integration, endless progress towards a way ahead in Okinawa and these sorts of things. But increasingly, if you look at leader statements, meetings between President Obama and Prime Minister Abe, you see issues in areas like Southeast Asia, coordination on regional and global issues taking a higher and higher priority. So adjusting our bilateral mechanisms to make sure that they're encompassing this new broader focus of the alliance is an important thing to do. And figuring out the precise, whether it's assistant secretaries or undersecretaries or what it is, I mean, that's certainly an important task for the next administration when they come in, to make sure that we have the correct mechanisms in place.
Right. Well, one kind of policy innovation in Japan we've seen after a lot of discussion is the creation of the National Security Council in Japan. I wondered if anyone on the panel would like to give an assessment of how the National Security Council in Japan is functioning, whether it's kind of met your expectations, or what changes may be necessary to enhance the ability of National Security Council to be an effective organization to pursue Japan's foreign relations. Anybody?
I think it was a big plus. I think this was one of the a resounding achievement for the Abe administration to strengthen this National Security Council apparatus. Japan's problem always has been stovepiped nature of decision-making process. And in the foreign policy making as well as national security policy making, that stovepipe structure always has hindered Japan from pursuing much more coherent and invigorated approach. I think that's under this administration, particularly after that they established the National Security Council apparatus. So basically, I think they have overcome this, I think, impediments. And that's one of the reasons why Abe administration foreign policy has been such an invigorated. I also should give a lot of credit to the director of National Security Council, Shotaro Yachi. He has been very, very, I think, effective. I think perhaps he and the National Security Council should have done more to strengthen that policy dialogue between National Security Council in the White House and Japan. And also, when it comes to that the policy dialogue between Japan and Russia, I think it's still, some further steps to be needed to be taken. But overall, I think that when it comes to the Japan-Sino rapprochement, as exemplified in the November 2014 agreement, I think without National Security Council function, it would have been much more difficult to achieve that.
Right, right.
Yes. I could just jump in with perhaps a note of caution and something to look out ahead as it relates to U.S. Japan relations. So the creation of the National Security Council in Japan happened to coincide at a time where it's certainly no secret that power of the National Security Council in Washington has increased. The size of the National Security Council has increased. The frequency with which the NSC has become operational has increased. And I think this is something, without a doubt, that the next U.S. administration will relook and think about how to empower the Department of State and the Department of Defense. So I think there'll be a little bit of a recalibration. And while it's certainly instinctively good for national security advisors in this country and other countries to have a dialogue, our director for Japan, director for Americas to speak from time to time, but making sure that we're not undercutting the State Department, Defense Department, and MOFA, I think is just a very important but technocratic and bureaucratic issue that we'll just have to rethink as the next U.S. administration takes
Japan's
their seat.
NSC has currently 70 staff, okay, compared to maybe 300 here in Washington, White House, right? If you have two vast apparatus, personnel, they are tempted to micromanage everything, and that's not good. I think 70 is, right size in my view.
And we need to make sure that assistant secretaries of state are speaking for the U.S. government when they and are not undercut by people out of the Kante.
So no discussion of U.S.-Japan relations can end without a discussion of China. And so I wanted to ask, obviously China is a country that is of such importance that the United States will need to engage significantly with China, as was mentioned by Kurt and Vikram in the previous discussion. Over the last several years, it appears that there have been certain times when there's been some concern expressed on the part of Japan about the U.S.-China relationship. I think many people in Japan obviously don't want the United States and China to be in conflict, but then when the United States and China to be in conflict, but when the United States and China appear to be getting too close and creating a G2, for instance, or great power relation just between two, that raises obviously concerns in Japan. I'd like to ask, especially the Japanese panelists, what is your expectation and what are your concerns about the relationship between the United States and China over the next several years and how Japan would relate to that? And maybe we can start with the China specialist.
Okay. Yeah. The more Japan and U.S. alliance becomes stronger, the more China will be raised the alert level to us. And China, for example, in recent days, they have been enacting a new law to regulate non-governmental organizations, which have a close relationship with foreign organizations. And I heard a lot of U.S. organizations who did a great contribution to institutional building in China are leaving China. And it is a very huge, great loss, I think, because they have done a lot of things to make China develop in a right track, healthy way. And if China cannot make a good economic development, it's going to be a disastrous result for all of us in the world. So China should understand the principle of market economy and should develop civil society. And I think U.S. and Japan can work together for that purposes. But the Chinese government is not is suspicious about us. So what we can do as an ally and as important actors in the global society, what we can do to make China a better place for everyone. Yeah, I've been feeling so much worried about China's future and the result that will cause to all of us.
Tim.
Let me address your question from the security dimensions. And we all know that the Chinese assertive behavior, especially since 2010, and that has been the major driving force of when we tried to create the new U.S. Japan Defense Cooperation Guideline, which was successfully concluded in April last year. But I still concerned that whether Washington and Tokyo are seeing the same nature of the China's rise in this part of the world. Because it's not only because Japan is geographically located more close to China, but I also like to mention that the change of the power balance, or the power transition, is more vividly happening in Northeast Asia than the broader question of the U.S.-China relationship. For example, we're dealing with so-called gray zone challenges on the daily basis. Chinese fishing boats, non-military vessels, Coast Guard ships are intruding our waters, every day. So that kind of challenges has become one of the major security threat or the risks since 2010 in our National Defense Planning Guideline. But from the Washington's point of view, that is all about like a longer-term management of the U.S.-China competition. Of course, there is a growing challenges of the anti-access and area denial, so that from the Pentagon's point of view, how to manage that new strategic circumstances in order to ensure the operational access of the U.S. Military during the contingency. That's the part how they see China. But at the same time, since 2012 and onwards, there have been a growing U.S.-China military-to-military confidence building measures, way ahead of what we are trying to do with China on that part. So that the complex nature of the U.S.-China dynamics has been going on. At the same time, we are facing with a more vivid security challenges. So this is the part why I think I'm very much concerned about the divergence of the interest, how we try to see China. But another word is that these kind of differences have been somewhat considerably well managed through the process of concluding the U.S. Japan Defense Cooperation Guideline, because it is the first time in our guideline that we mention about the notion of the seamless coordination among two nations. And the seamless means that we actually coordinate from the peacetime to contingency. That includes the armed attack situation is not happening. That literally means that the U.S. Japan alliance one of the main agenda that includes the gray zone challenges. So the United States understands what we are getting at, especially since 2014 and onwards. And Japan also had its own efforts to conclude our security legislation, which also paved the way to long-time ban to revise our interpretation on the exercising of the collective self-defense. That is also expand the menu of self-defense force cooperation to the United States during the contingency. It is also our own efforts to respond to the U.S. Concern to the region. So that there has been a tuning between two sides, but underlying there has been somewhat the caution that we may be different. We may be observing the different nature of the rise of China.
So Yoichi, you've been a long-time observer of China. As I recall, you studied with Eto Shinkichi back in the 1960s at Tokyo University. So you obviously have some strong views about the China relationship. But what is your sense of the
U.S.-China
U.S.-Japan and U.S.-China relationship?
I think basically we're on the same page, the U.S. and Japan, how to see China's challenge, the opportunities and challenges both. But I think there have been some kind of perception gap in my view, which has been very much salient these days, particularly with regard to the East China Sea as well as South China Sea maritime security issues. Rising power typically actually is a free rider on the global stage, but revisionist on the regional setting. And China is not alone. So I think that China's sort of assertiveness actually has been much more pronounced on the regional level. And I think that there has emerged some kind of, perception gap here. Certainly, President Obama has firmly pledged the United States commitment to Article 5 of U.S. Japan Security Treaty. It has been very much reassuring to the Japanese and to that perhaps the region as a whole, particularly Southeast Asia too. And the United States, in some cases, actually has, pursued the cost-imposing measures on China when the United States perceived China's behavior as a violation of the U.S. vital interests, such as cybersecurity. So the United States certainly, is not always soft on China, as some Japanese would argue, or would tend to argue. But nonetheless, I think that this regional, situation and domain awareness actually has to be much more shared between Tokyo and Washington. Another problem is that Washington's policy making, some problems with regard to China policy. For instance, while the United States pursues very energetically to conclude that climate change, and that's good. That's in the best interest for whole mankind. Burning up the earth will eventually the most existential threat to all of us. But that does not mean that the United States will allow or subordinate that vital interest with allies to those global issues. You also should think of why the United States actually has not subscribed to AIIB, for instance. This is not necessarily zero sum. This can be plus sum, and this is not directly related to the deterrence issues. It's more regional building, regional order issues. And you just cannot dictate your terms without being in the tent. You just cannot cop from a sideline. Okay? If you want to have an influence, you have to be in. And so I really think that how the United States really will pursue a coherent policy toward China it does not seem to be that coherent. On the one hand, you reject, AIIB proposal. On the other hand, you pursue climate change. And in the between, you have to pursue that to ensure that U.S. allies in the region. So I think that decision-making process is another problem.
So that reminds you, though, then, is it your view that Japan's decision not to join AIIB is in part because of the United States? Or is it, if Japan were to pursue its independent policy?
Yeah, this is getting back. Getting back to your point, in what way Japan actually has pursued the independent approach, if not independent policy. I think I personally really have wished that Japan would have participated in AIIB, and preferably in coordination with the United States. But given that the United States extreme difficulty in getting the Congress approve this, I think that Japan perhaps should have gone ahead and have in close consultation with the United States. It does not necessarily mean that Japan will be an independent seeker, okay? But at the same time, I think that Japan really should have explored more approach independently, in tandem with that, in close consultation with the United States. That's, I think, a missed opportunity in my view.
So Brian, what's your view of this issue of U.S.-China relations and relationship with Japan?
It's fundamental, right? This is the question, right? And I think all too often in this town we have the U.S.-China specialists and the U.S.-Japan specialists talking separately about what the next steps are in these relationships. Fortunately, I would not consider myself particularly an expert in either, but dabble in both and see these conversations. I think a lot of the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance conversation that happens in Washington and Tokyo doesn't start with the assumption that the U.S. and China are going to have a cooperative agenda, right? And I think that if we think about the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance, the first thing we need to do is assume that the next U.S. administration is not just going to be looking at U.S.-Japan alliance as some sort of deterrent or a hedge solely against China. The next U.S. administration, no matter who it is, ultimately will be looking for a common agenda to work with China on big issues. If you would, and balancing the various aspects of the U.S.-China relationship will again be a challenge. If you had asked President Obama at the beginning of 2015 what his top 2 priorities were for 2015 on foreign policy, he probably would have said the Paris climate negotiations and the Iran nuclear deal. And it turned out that China was a key partner on those 2 top issues. It didn't mean that President Obama wasn't interested in the rule-based order in the Asia-Pacific or a gray zone contingency, but there is that inherent balancing of priorities, and they will intermingle. I don't know what the next big U.S.-China area of cooperation is. The U.S.-China relationship is not trending in a good direction right now, but that next area will come up. The United States will work with China on it, and managing and making sure that there's confidence in Tokyo that somehow the U.S.-Japan alliance will not be sacrificed for it is a fundamental question.
I'd like to switch to TPP. It's a subject that both the United States and Japan have spent considerable efforts on, and I understand that the Japanese Diet is in the process of ratifying the TPP. We'll see whether the U.S. Congress in the lame duck session does so as well. But I think most observers at this point believe that the probability of TPP being ratified in the lame duck session is, say, less than 50%. Some would say 0, but it's somewhere between 0 and 50%. If it were to come about that the TPP is not ratified, what would be the implications for Japan? How much importance does Japan place on the TPP, and how important is it for the TPP to come into to be realized?
Glenn, you are really expert on this.
I want to hear the Japanese views.
I think it would be really devastating to Japan, not only to Japan, but as a region as a whole. because TPP is not just a tariff or non-tariff barrier. It's not only trade issues. Basically, it's about that, the regional order, but also global standard norms and rules. It's really, I think, concerns where we stand. It's free trade. I think it's really concerns the liberal international order. So it's not I think that the failure of ratify TPP agreements in the U.S. Congress will have far-reaching implications for years to come. I think that it will be a huge setback to Abe government, Abenomics particularly. Abe has expended so much political capital on a TPP agreement. He's determined to ratify that in the U.S. In the Japan's that in this coming session, that session, and certainly he would do that in anticipation of giving munitions to Obama, so that Obama can put pressure on the U.S. Congress to pass that, to ratify that in the MTAX period. Who knows how it will play out, but maybe very difficult, perhaps less than 50%. But I think that's what he is trying to do, and I think it's very much commendable effort. In the past, Japan always has been on the receiving end to have gaiatsu, out of pressure from Washington. Okay, but this time now, it's Japan which really is trying to put some subtle gaiatsu. But the beauty of gaiatsu, when it's really effective, is to really bring about naiatsu, internal pressure, so that the politicians can harness this internal pressure to push for their agenda. Okay, and in Japan's case, Japan's structural reform always have been made successful coupled with that free trade measures. So reform has been inevitably entwined with the open door. Since 1994, when that Japan concluded Uruguay Round, we have not had any multilateral large-scale trade liberalization. I think that's one of the reasons why Japan has not engaged in structural reform over the past 20 years, and that has coincided with the loss of decade.
And I want to ask you, Yoichi answered primarily from the standpoint of the impact on Japan. What do you think the implications would be for the United States and the region as an international relations specialist for TPP not to be ratified?
Well, I think Tokyo and Washington should share the notion that TPP is too important to fail. And I think it is the fundamental pillar of the U.S. rebalancing strategy in Asia on the economic dimension. It is the way U.S. business, outreach to Asia, or the production networks and sales networks, with a high standard of the tariff reduction. And it is not only about the tariff reduction, it is about standardization of many aspects. It is about the business practices, environmental standards, labor situation, protection of the many rights, including the IPRs and so on. And that can be one of the leading kind of standards to helping those emerging economies to be in those standardized model of the economic liberalization model in Asia. And even the alternative kind of a framework like RCEP and also ASEAN+3 standards are way behind in terms of those high quality standards of institutionalization. So that I think that TPP is very important in the way that the Japan and the United States will lead to create the economic order of the 21st century. What happened if we fail to do so? And you mentioned about the plan B yesterday, but we haven't really found what will be the plausible plan B scenario. RCEP may be the one, but it has been in the slow progress, and that has been the, I think, collective mixture of the bilateral FTAs, which is a spaghetti bowl. And then I think we can only get kind of the standards where every participant can agree. So it is the kind of different way of approach what the way TPP tries to achieve. So I think what we can achieve if we fail the TPP is only the secondary standards of the trade order in Asia. So that something that I would like to emphasize here is that it is too big to fail, and I think we really need to recognize the result of that.
I want to leave time for questions from the audience, but Professor Ako or Brian, do you have some views on TPP that you'd like to share with us? Okay, well, we have about 15 minutes left, and so I welcome questions from the audience, and the microphone will be given to you, so if you could be sure to mention your name and affiliation. The gentleman here on the aisle.
It's being webcast. So.
Batteries.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. For Professor Ako, recently when I was in China, I met a high school teacher who informed me that those people in Hong Kong and Taiwan, they don't like us. So I don't like them. But the country I like is Japan. He had been twice to Japan. She was eager to go a third time, and she had been studying Japanese. And it suggested to me that there's an underlying current of respect, friendliness, and interest in China among the people for Japan. And I wonder, is this important as a part of Chinese popular opinion? And secondly, what could be done to encourage it?
Thank you for such a great question. Yeah, I think nowadays a lot of Chinese tourists are coming to Japan, and they don't necessarily have to join tours. They can arrange their private trips and they can go wherever they want to go, and they make friends. They visit families, and they experience, school life. Some Chinese students are coming to schools in Japan. So it's a very good face-to-face, people-to-people exchanges. But on the other hand, Chinese government official media are producing a lot of dramas, like anti-Japan, those dramas. But of course, they are watching those TV programs, but they are having independent thinking. Yeah, and of course, I'm worried about the relationship between China and Hong Kong, Taiwan, particularly those younger generations in Hong Kong and Taiwan. They want autonomy. They want freedom. And China is restricting freedom of speech. A lot of my friends have been arrested. I've been very much, worried about them. And I've been doing a lot of field work, and I've been doing research on China for many years. But I never experienced such a lot of sadness and, about what's happening in China. So I could understand what those younger generations in Hong Kong and Taiwan are feeling. And I really hope that China can release, can have more freedom of speech. Otherwise, they are, it's Hong Kong, Taiwan people, all of them are Chinese. But why they have to fight each other? Yeah, so freedom of speech is very important for China's future and for other part of the world.
If I could just connect it briefly to another important thing that Professor Ako raised earlier, is China's foreign NGO law. And this is something that we're very concerned about here at the Center for American Progress. As the law is currently written, any sort of exchange, even us as an NGO going to China, we're going to have police supervision. We're going to have a Chinese institution taking our funds for traveling around the country, and it will essentially put us under police supervision. I can understand the rationale why certain the Beijing might not want certain legal or human rights organizations, but putting this vast net over university and NGO activities in China certainly doesn't encourage the kind of independence and intellectual and cultural exchange that breeds more mutual understanding.
Okay, another question. We go to the other side. Person with a cap there.
Half of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. I'm Andre Sopajo, and I'm the a partner and director for Vietnam, Southeast Asia, in Washington, D.C. for the Interstate Traveler Company. Now, it's a wonderful panel, and so edifying. My question is this, has to do with sort of the relationship between the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the security question you've all discussed so well. And the short way to say the question is, will approval of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I surely hope happens, will that also be an inducement to China to cease and desist its continued use of violence and threats of violence to violate the exclusive economic zones of so many countries, Vietnam, Philippines, etc.? That's my question.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that TPP is another example of how we can place the rule-based international order in Asia-Pacific region. And I think we are in the ratification processes. We have a lot of conditions. I think we have to complete within 2 years, and 85% of those countries who sign up for the TPP has to, ratify to actually issue the formal process moving forward. So if the United States has been in deep trouble, especially in the Congress of the ratification process, I think countries like Japan, Vietnam, and other regional partners has to address that how important this is for us and for the United States through those parliamentary ratification process ahead of the United States. Those are, I think, pretty much important. And secondly, in the implication for security, well, TPP has its own strategic implication, so that if China believes that those are the preferential kind of arrangements, which TPP signatory country has a huge benefit out of it, and that will, induce other non-TPP signatory members to liberalize and reform, to standardize its relation to the TPP signatory country. That has been the expected spillover effect in the region to have a better regional order. And what about EEZ, what you mentioned? I think another case of the rule-based international order, how much we respect the international law, including UNCLOS and also the recent Hague arbitration rulings, so that these may be the approaches we should really have an importance on it, and then to address to China and also participating members how much those multilateral international kind of consensus rule-based order may constitute the future progress of how the stable order should be built in Asia.
Panelists want to comment on this? No? Okay, let me go toward the back, way back there. Our friend from Asan Institute.
Gil Rosman, the ASEAN Forum. My question is for you, Ken and Yoichi. What makes you think that there are two Russias, the Russia in East Asia and the Russia in the rest of the world? I've seen very little in Japanese writings to back up this growing assertion, the growing assumption that there is a way to transform Russia's foreign policy in East Asia. Beyond that, I mean, I think the U.S. should be wholly in favor of the territorial agreement, with Japan getting back 2 islands, which Russia has offered over and over again, and now Japan will take the deal essentially. But what about the assumption that you all are emphasizing so much, that this is going to change Russian foreign policy, and that you understand Sino-Russian relations better than many others who don't think Japan really has much leverage on Russia's turn towards China?
Ken or Yoichi, or both.
So what is the essence of your question? Would you repeat again?
Why do you have confidence that Japan will be able to turn Russia from relying very heavily on China and its general assertive foreign policy internationally because it has a deal with Japan? Why do you think there are two Russias, the Russia Americans observing and the Russia Japan is hoping will come about as a result of this agreement between Abe and Putin?
I think, we have had this unresolved issues for more than 70 years. I'm again talking about from Japanese point of views. It has been very much unhealthy, and it could destabilize the whole region, the whole world. I think it is imperative for Japan and Russia to diffuse this tension and preferably, I think, settle these issues. Certainly Russian political culture, the nature of that political regime is not that perhaps that best we should hope for. But looking back over the past, Japan's normalization with China and South Korea, respectively 1972, 1965. In China's case, it was totalitarian regime, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai. We did not care, actually, what kind of nature of the regime was. In case of South Korea, it was authoritarian regime. And perhaps it could be really easier for the nations to really accommodate on the vital issues with that very strong leadership, even if it's a lack of democratic process and institutions. So I think that certainly, Russia may not be that, particularly under Putin's leadership, may not be that most desirable political entity. But I think for that purposes for accommodation, that may be that once in lifetime opportunity for Japan and Russia to accommodate. I may be totally wrong. Russia may not calculate the way I have described. I do not think that we are pursuing this accommodation with Russia in taking account of China factor. It won't happen. We cannot use Russian card vis-a-vis China. We certainly cannot unleash Russia against China. Russia will not respond in that way. But perhaps that we could perhaps lessen some probability for Russia and China to even to further solidify their entente by Japan reaching out to Russia and getting better relationship with Russia. Japan's government has taken a very strong, firm position not to uphold the G7 commitment. Japan certainly would not allow itself to get it peeled away from the G7 by accommodating with Russia. So I think that's a very much sensible approach, and I think with a very strategic calculus. This is not a reaction. This is a more proactive approach. That's the reason why I have supported that.
Well, I think, Gil, you'll be the best person to answer these sets of questions, but I think that the Japanese government is not too naive, that we understand this is a high-risk diplomatic engagement if it is not handled properly. And the outcome of the Russian engagement may not be as much as what we expected, even though we may have a risk of giving up some of the long-standing principle over the Northern Territory issues. But at the same time, there have been a lot of potentials, how Russia can be constructive player in Asia. And we also have a common goal to avoid the old-fashioned China-Russia strategic entanglements. Russia has been a player of the institutionalized process, which Kurt mentioned, EAS, East Asian Summit, ADMM Plus, regular member to be involved. And Russia has its own strategic engagement to Vietnam. So it has its own stake in Southeast Asia and the situation in the South China Sea. Certainly, we need the opportunity for cooperation and to navigate Russia to be in the direction what the Asia needs. And that's why I firmly believe that this is the interest of the U.S. Japan alliance.
Okay, I know that there are a lot of more questions, but it's already 11:30, and we promised a hard stop at 11:30. I would just say that I think we've had a very full discussion, both with Kurt and Vikram and the panelists today, and rest assured that this is only the first of several of these discussions we'll be having at the Center for American Progress. And so I very much want to thank the panelists today for their excellent discussion and for the audience coming today. And please stay tuned for additional discussions like this that we'll have here at the Center for American Progress. Thank you very much.